Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Carnegie. Really delighted that you're all joining us here today, whether in person or those of you who are joining online. Thank you for participating in what I think will be a really interesting discussion. My name is Saskia Brechtenmacher. I am a fellow in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And it's my real pleasure and honor to introduce our guest today, Latanya Mapp Frett, who's the president and CEO of Global Fund for Women, the largest fund of women's rights organizations around the world. So a few words about Latanya before I hand over the mic to her. She has a long career working on women's rights issues, human rights issues around the world. Before joining Global Fund for Women, she was the director of Planned Parenthood Global, so the international branch of the Planned Parenthood many of you will be familiar with in the US. She also previously worked for the United Nations Children Fund, for USAID, and was actually a delegate to the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, which I have many questions about that alone, about that experience. And started her career here in Washington, D.C. As a lawyer. So we are really delighted to host her here today for a conversation about her new book, which is called The Everyday Feminist, The Key to Sustainable Social Impact, in which she draws on her career working with and alongside feminist movements in different parts of the world to explore both the power of feminist movements and why they're so effective at driving social change, but also why we're so often, why the international community still fails to recognize that power and how we can better support those movements through our funding and through other kinds of political and diplomatic support. Please join me in welcoming her to Carnegie.
Thank you. Thank you, Saskia.
So we'll structure a conversation as follows. I have a series of questions for Latanya about her book that will allow her a little bit to elaborate on some of the key insights. But then I also want to open it up to all of you who are in the room here today to ask some questions of her. So we'll end with that. To kick things off, Latanya.
Sure.
There are many things I really enjoyed about your book, but I wanted to ask a little bit, or I wanted to locate the book a little bit in your own feminist journey to start things off. So I'm curious, looking beyond the journey, the biography I just shared with the audience. When did you first encounter feminism or feminist ideas in your own life? And how did your relationship to feminism change as you moved through your career?
No, thank you, Saskia, and thank you for Carnegie for the invitation to have these conversations. I think it's important to understand that I never considered myself a feminist growing up, mostly because when I was in middle school and my grandmother, sort of was talking to me, I was doing a report on the Equal Rights Amendment. I asked her about feminism, the word, and was she a feminist from what I understood? And she was like, oh, God, no. Those are white women that live on the other side of town. They're mostly rich and they have a lot of time on their hands. And I was like, okay, so that was my impression. I would hear the word from, point to point. And I think it wasn't until the Beijing conference that the word really started showing up for me again. In this book, fast forward, almost 30 years, this book is really a way to reclaim the word. Because I think most people, when they hear the word, they think of incredible people, Gloria Steinem and others who have been doing this work. And since then, and I think there's actually a film coming out about Sojourner Truth, I start really kind of looking back on who was in the room, who didn't get credit for when that term came about. And so this book is talking about those people. I'd like people to think about, everyday women who are doing this work, showing up all the time, whether they're the head of the PTA or whether they're running for president. These are people that maybe don't necessarily go by this word because it's maybe called different things in different cultures and different countries and different parts of the world, but who fit a characteristic of which I talk about in the book, mostly, who keep doing the work, who have always stated that genders were equal, have always shown that in the way they've shown up for their communities, have always been doing the work. I'd like us to reclaim that word for them, and I'd like it to be a word we think of, honestly, when we think of who are our first feminist examples, which are our mothers and our grandmothers.
Yeah, you just addressed one of the core premises of the book that I really appreciated, which is that we shouldn't just look to the biggest names or the big political leaders when we think about who's driving social change.
Yeah.
But instead, you direct our gaze or the reader's gaze to the women who are doing the everyday work of building movements and building social change. And so I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that premise,
Yeah.
because you called the book the Everyday Feminist. So what does that mean to you? What does everyday feminism mean to you? And can you talk a little bit about the concept and why do you think it matters to direct our gaze to these local actors?
Yeah. So, and again, very personal. I've lived in more than 15 countries around the world, whether I was with the UN or the Foreign Service or, sort of working in NGOs, and now with the Global Fund for Women. Every place that I've ever lived, there was always at least one, but usually more, women who showed up for me in that work, who understood what it meant to be a Black woman leader in these spaces, understood the networks that I probably didn't have, showed me the ropes. And, and when I'm talking about how women showing up, I'm not talking about, one chapter I talk about the governor's wife in Nigeria, but in other ways, it's, I start the book talking about Innocent, who was my braider, who did my braids when I lived in Kenya, but was a refugee from Burundi and opened up her salon to so many different refugees coming from Rwanda and Burundi during the genocide, offering them all kinds of support from immigration law, from counseling for women in violence, getting kids into schools. I mean, and we all know people like this, who are just going to be there for their communities. And so for me, when I think, and I hope most people think of the feminist in their life, they're thinking about these kind of women who make sure that there is resources for their community. And, and I also have a chapter that says, feminists don't just work for, it says feminists work for men and boys too. Because often what you're finding is that these women are doing this work with very little resources, often their own resources, but they're doing a much more intersectional approach to community development. And so many of us who have come from international development, many of us that work in these spaces, I think it will behoove us to think about the feminist values and principles that go in collaborating and actually trusting communities to do this work. And that starts with these women who are right there to help you, and they show up fast, they do the work, and they really show you the path and solutions for helping and supporting communities.
Yeah, and throughout your book, it's not just about everyday feminism, it's really a book about movements as well and movement building. Yeah. And I was really struck that throughout the book, you talk about movements that you've been a part of, that you've encountered in your work or in your life. And those weren't just movements about gender justice or about feminism.
That's right.
Instead, you take a much broader approach and you actually locate everyday feminism in movements that are about other social goals and say, actually, if you look closely, who is in those movements and who is doing the work in those movements, it's often women and it's often the people you call everyday feminists. Could you talk a bit about that choice to look at movements with that broad lens rather than just thinking about feminist movements?
Right. And it's, I kind of thought about adding that in after some of the discussion with editors, someone mentioned, they didn't know that the Black Panther Party was run by a woman at some point. And I'm like, yeah, but not only was it run by Elaine Brown at some point, she started, she didn't just get there, just come out and apply for the job. She had been doing all of the community work, starting the schools, starting the hospital centers, starting all of that, the sort of centers for families that didn't have homes. So all of that community-based work she had done, and then she grew into be a leader for the period of time that she was leading. And so it dawned on me that there are so many movements that even, people remember the male leaders of them, but they don't really remember where some of the real core work was happening, both in the communities, but across the country, both here in the U.S. and other places around the world. I mean, we talk about, and I talk about the apartheid movement as well. I mean, and all the female leaders, there's books written, but still, we don't talk about them. You know, we don't remember their names, and you know, we know whose names we remember, and it's great. But I thought it was going to be really important that we understand that the genesis of social movements has been around this feminist energy from the beginning. And so many of the movements that we know, I mean, the civil rights movement is a classic one too, has had this feminist energy and women doing so much work that I think it would behoove us, as we think about how social change happens in a world where we know there's great transformation happening. How do we lift them up? How do we resource them? How do we help them and fuel that work that they're doing, both in their communities and nationwide?
And part of the story you tell is really a story of impact, right? You just mentioned the anti-apartheid movement. That's a hugely successful movement, right? That we point to the civil rights movement in the US. So tracing the story of how much impact these movements have had. And I'm curious if you could reflect a little bit on the factors that you think made those movements effective, what you've learned from your work working with movements, and what does everyday feminism have to do with that effectiveness?
Sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of sort of research now done on the impact of social movements and how it impacts and affects social change. And I mean, Global Fund for Women has been looking at this for more than 10 years, and there has been researchers from academics that in fact say it is the most sustainable, impactful way to have social change. And we think about things like the rollback on Roe and other ways that things have shown up for maybe movements that feel like they haven't done enough or we didn't keep it. And I, like to point to where things happen, social change happens when there are people and communities that are doing and driving the work. Changing laws are fabulous, and I know around this room there's lots of people whose policy change is where they live, but it's that social and cultural change, it's neighbors talking to each other that's so much important. And this is where then the feminist movements and energy comes in. So getting it, passing a law is great, but how do you actually implement a law? How do you actually talk to communities about what laws mean and what you have a right to and what that means for you personally is where I believe strongly that feminist movements are the key to ensuring that happens. And I use the word feminist and women's movements interchangeably, but I mean, these are not movements that are just focused on women, but they use feminist principles of community, of support, of engagement and collaboration in order to do their work. And so many of the movements that I speak about and I introduce these women who have been doing that is because I want people to understand that is a really important and sustainable way to actually see change happen.
Maybe just to build on that, you just mentioned feminist principles, and I remember in the book you actually have a really interesting list of what you have come to think of as feminist principles. Could you just reflect on that for the audience? What are some of those principles that you see again and again in the work that these women are doing?
I think, and much of it is really around the sort of a value system, a core system of collaboration, of authenticity. I use the word a lot of showing up, actually being present, of including, being very inclusive, being intersectional, so not, you see this all the time, movements that don't work with other movements are not successful, right? So, movements that include all types of people, not just, we talk about people living at the margins, but also making room for other people who can resource the movement and having them in. So, I listed on page 10 in case people are looking, but it is really about, looking at movements as a much broader concept and looking at feminist values as ones that really align closely with how a successful movement and social change happens.
Switching gears a little bit, I mean, one of the key insights, maybe more dispiriting insights that emerges from the book is that there are really big problems with our current funding ecosystem and how we support these movements. There's been a huge increase in gender equality aid. If we look back over the past 10 years, governments are spending a lot on gender equality, but somehow it doesn't always reach these actors, or it rarely reaches them, in fact. Why do you think this gap persists, this funding gap that you've identified in the book and that you elaborate on? And have you seen any promising models or ways that that's slowly starting to change?
I do, but here's the challenge. We have looked at, and we've all seen the numbers, roughly 1.9% of philanthropic funding that goes to communities is given to local women's groups. So, I mean, it's a scary number, and sometimes it's almost unbelievable how low it is. And when you lift that up to more international sort of donor base, OECD puts out a report every year and shows how much of that money gets down, and it's half of that. It's less than 1%, right? So we can actually calculate how ineffective it is. So this disconnect, and we've talked about it, you and I also, but this disconnect between social change is being shown as social movements is being shown as the most effective way to meet social change, but yet the resourcing of that of those social movements is so low, particularly when they are run by women, particularly when the organizations involved are run by women. And then you add on top of that those organizations that are run by women of color, and then specifically Black women. I just saw the Black Feminist Fund data on it being 0.05%, something gross, So we are actually seeing, because then you look, I say, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all around, so a lot of social movements that are actually started by and run by women of color, then if they are the most impactful way to create social change, but they are the least funded, then we got a problem. We have a problem. And some of what the book is trying to say is that if we're trying to see that kind of impact, we're going to have to step up the funding. And it really means, and I think we're starting to do this, looking at where is the funding going if it's not going over there. And, and looking at our values in funding and changing those characteristics. And in the book, I give examples towards the end and the conclusion, these are the things that we might want to start doing. This is how we show up for these women that are doing this work, and this is how we change it. Because we have to change from inside, the way we think about them and the way we value. And it goes to things like care work. It's what we value about what women do is a big part of it, and what we expect them to do with no resources. The whole mama effect. Just take care of the kids in the house, and you don't need to get paid. These women need to pay themselves. They need to pay the people they have. They need to build infrastructure around them so that their organizations are sustainable for the movements where change is happening. So I talk about a lot of those things in the book because we can't just be like, it's so great. She's always there. She always shows up. She's so great. And then when she asks for money, be like, oh, I have a couple of dollars, that we have to change the way we think about that completely if we want to see the kind of societal changes that I think we're actually trying to move into.
One of the things you hear sometimes funders say, right, is that, it's risky. We don't know these organizations. We have our partners that we have a long relationship with, that we've worked with for a long time, that are based here in DC or New York or what. What do you say to those funders? What do you say to that question of, it's risky to fund these unknown local actors? We don't know their agendas, how political they are, et cetera.
It's actually quite upsetting because I think, when I say it, rethink what a risk is, and what, risk means you're trying to evaluate what the outcome is against what are certain, possible fallbacks that might happen, I'll say. And so when you look at the big possible impact that is, could come from funding an organization, then it just seems crazy that you would do that with some very large organizations who have far more risky outcomes than local groups who are doing this work. They have been doing it usually far longer in their communities. Often when we fund these other what we call less risky organizations, they're literally just going into the community. So there's no accountability there. They don't know the people. If they get in there and misappropriate the funds and get out, nobody's really even knows where to find them. These are people that are grounded in their communities. And so when you're giving them resources, they actually are accountable to a set of people that if they don't spend that money well, then we'll very much hold them, to task about that. And we'll very much talk to both them and their communities about that. So I'm always a little perplexed about how we're evaluating risk and what that means. I think it's less about the risk and it's more about what you're comfortable with. And I talk a little bit about in the book about some research that I've seen. I mean, this is like the bias that we hold. And so it's not really risk, it's just that I don't know if I trust people that don't look like me, don't think like me, don't come from the place that I come from. And that stuff we can change inside. We can change that bias. Because these are not risky organizations, and Global Fund for Women has been doing this for 40 years. And there's been no major misappropriation in the organization. And we have this beautiful system of what we call advisors. When there is a problem, it's kind of like we deploy them to see what the issues are, and then how do we get to the bottom of it. And there's been not single one really major misappropriation that has happened at the organization to speak of. And so then, you start, I also worked in organizations, and I'm talking about even U.S. government, where there's been major misappropriations, and there is not that, sort of settling. And so those things happen, and then people are right back to business after we kind of point it out and be like, okay, well, now you trust them again. So why don't we just extend that trust to the people who are in the communities who are doing this work? Why don't we work with them so that they even learn better how to comply with certain mechanisms that we feel are appropriate? Because that's what we feel like we're going to do at Global Fund for Women. We're going to trust them to do what they've been doing for decades, and we're going to trust that if we resource them well, that these social movements will make change happen.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point to kind of reconsider what we mean by risk and what kind of risk are we talking about. And there might be many risks in the current funding model as well that we're not capturing because we have this very narrow lens. Another theme I wanted to touch on is this, what you just raised, this issue of being close to the communities and the problems that you're working on. And you identify that as one of the real strengths of the Everyday Feminists, right? They don't just come into a community after a crisis and try to solve everyone's problems, but they come out of that community, and so they understand it. And they might also understand what solutions are likely to work and which ones might backfire. And so that's a really important strength that they have. But the reality of this room and a lot of people here is that we're quite far removed from some of the issues and problems we're working on, right? We're based in headquarters and donor agencies and INGO headquarters. So there is that tension that a lot of us face of wanting to do good things but being far removed. And I think even for activists that comes up sometimes, right? As they get more successful and rise up in their organizations, they're farther removed from the issues they started out on. Could you reflect a bit on that tension? How do we navigate that? How do we ensure that, our solutions are still close to the ground, even as the decisions are being made much higher up, in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, or within our organizations, even that tension between those doing the frontline work and those doing the management and higher level decision making?
Yeah, it's fairly simple. Include them. Have them at the table when we're making the decisions, because I think we make it a little complicated. It's like, oh, we have to put together this whole thing, this whole strategy on climate justice, when maybe just ask what the community has been doing on climate justice, because it didn't start in your boardroom, for sure. It's been something that they've been working on, and they've come up with solutions. We were just in Barbados, and we were talking to, we fund, of course, organizations there that are part of the climate justice movement. And we were talking to the fisherwomen about what's happening. I mean, it's a real shift happening. I think we understand what's happening with climate, but I'm not so sure that we understand how people have been responding. Because it didn't just happen. So the water is warm, the sea is rising, the waters are getting warmer, the fish are actually moving to different places. And so the women who have been selling the fish, they're in the marketplace, they do the cleaning, they sell, have actually, the price of fish has been getting higher because the fisher, mostly men, have had to go out further to get the fish. And so you're using more, just go through the value chain, you're using more gas. And, so they have to pay more, but they can't charge more because there's no demand to pay more. And so they are talking about these climate issues. And so one of the questions is just, how do we fix this then? How do we ensure that you have the income you need to continue to send your children to school, to continue to house you, and all the basics of humanity? And they were like, well, what we're trying to do is to buy a machine that will allow us to use all of the, when we clean the fish, normally you just take all the spare, rubbish that come from cleaning the fish, and you put it in the garbage or back in the sea. And they were saying now they want to use it, and they actually want to make like feed with it, fertilizer and feed. And so, I mean, they had it all figured out. Honestly. And I don't think any of us was expecting them. They actually were looking at the cost of it, which was enormous to get this machine that they could buy. But this is how they would be able to use it. These are even people that they could sell it to, both in their island, but in other islands. And so, I mean, they just went on with this, and it was just shocking that, well, okay, there we go. So, I mean, why not try that? Why not? We're sitting up here thinking of all these ways that we could support, but the answer is like right there in front of us. And even if that's not the answer, let's try that. Let's see if that works. And so oftentimes I hear this about how it's so difficult. We're coming up strategies around, this or that. And my question is, did we even ask what it is they're doing already, and what our resources could be used to further in their current work? And then the next chapter of that is we're kind of looking ahead and trying to be innovative. It's like, are we even having them at the table to have those discussions? Because often we kind of know, they should, be able to respond. But what we do is we create a whole thing, and then we're like, here, is this work for you? Or can you give me a proposal on that thing that I just wrote that we spent like a year coming up with? And they're like, okay, well, here's your proposal on that thing. But in the meantime, they've been working on all these other issues. So I think part of the challenge is not being afraid to have people at the table as you're ideating, and as you're thinking about change, whether social change, economic change, or even political change, but have the people that you're talking about in the room. And I think that brings us a great deal closer to where we're trying to move.
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me, we have the UN General Assembly happening this month, and I think that's been such a long-standing demand on the side of many women's organizations to get more access to these spaces, right, to the high-level UN meetings, and to be at the table and not just be consulted afterwards.
Afterwards, yeah, with the pretty language that most people don't even understand, yeah.
We do see some change happening. I think in recent years in the development spaces I've been in, increasingly you hear people say we need to shift the power, and move away from this very top-down way of decision-making. Now, that's easier said than done because there are bureaucracies involved and they change not very quickly. But I'm just curious, what do you envision what a more equitable sort of system look like, funding system look like? What would have to change to realize the vision that you're putting forward? Yes, I mean, I know I come from a bureaucracy, a couple of them that are very slow churning. But I don't think it has to be that hard. I talk in the book about sort of diversifying your investment portfolio, and so, I'm not saying that, sort of these big, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit NGOs don't have something to offer to the ecosystem. I very much think they do. I also know they need to have people at the table for the communities that they're talking about. But I do think that change could be a lot easier if we think about it that way. Like a certain part of the portfolio of bilaterals could go to the larger organizations that can, sort of grind down and bring in resources that's required for the communities and the countries. But then you also have to have a certain amount of that portfolio that is working with groups that have been in those communities and are doing that work. And then, also, if you don't have those relationships, which maybe you don't, because maybe there's been political issues that have prevented you from having those kind of relationships, then work with people that do. And continue to fund them. And so your portfolio can look like, okay, well, a certain amount for this, 30% for that, 20% for that. I mean, that's how we all pretty much do our portfolios, right? Some stuff's going to be a little more, risky in your eyes. Other stuff is going to be a lot more sort of, larger, maybe even, you're paying for a great deal of that with
people living in these countries and with high salaries and stuff. But I do think that there's a way to do this that allows you to use certain compliance and other bureaucratic reporting structures for some of them, because you're giving them billions, because you are. And then for the other parts where you're giving, sort of less than that, then you can free up a little bit. So I do think, and I actually know that bilaterals are working this way, trying to think that way, like how we can do it, in different lanes and different pots in some ways. And I think you can come up with, and actually partnering that way, I think you can come up with a lot more impact than you could have before. But when you put all your eggs in one basket, as you know, you get what we got. So, yeah.
I have a couple more questions for you
sure.
before I open it up to the audience. But the first one is one about failure or resistance, right? We're seeing new forms of feminist mobilization or ongoing forms of feminist mobilization as you document in the book, but we're also seeing new forms of resistance. And here in the US, we've had the big setback last year with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and that's generated a lot of new action, but also a sense of despair among some. Globally, of course, there's many examples to point to where feminist activism is encountering a lot of pushback. Well-funded, well-coordinated pushback. So from the feminist activists that you've worked with, what have you learned about how they grapple with this question of failure or the question of resistance? How do you keep doing that work in the face of pushback?
Yeah, I agree. I think we're living in a moment where we're seeing a lot more pushback. And what's worse, I think we've seen a lot more co-opting of language. A lot of rhetoric being sort of used differently depending on which side of the room you're in, which I think in this lack of communication is hard. When you're talking about social change, even political change, it's hard when we're all using the same words but meaning different things. So I'm really concerned about that, and I see that a lot because I would say that most of the feminist movements and organizations that I've worked with, I think they do see paths for communication with people across the aisle, with people who feel differently, people who might think differently in an approach, and not seeing that as a problem, seeing that as the way our societies work. It's the way we come to consensus. It's the way that we drive action. So now it's a little bit I think it's a little bit difficult when we're both like, gender equality is important, and then we close civil spaces and women's organizations can't do their work. But gender equality is important. And we've been thinking about that at Global Fund for Women a lot, like who is accountable to who? Because I think some of that means that, we could think about it as failure, but I think it's an accountability issue. I think it's an issue of, is the government accountable to its people? Is the organization, going to be accountable to its communities? And I think if we get at that, and accountability means that you can't just ask one person, and you certainly can't self-describe accountability. And so what we've been thinking about at Global Fund for Women is how do civil society actors, and in particular women's groups, actually report, using that word, report on what commitments have been made, whether that's by governments or corporations or even by large organizations. Where is their word on these things? Because we know they have a word, and we know their communities actually feel a certain way about something, but how are we lifting that up as organizations that are working in this field? So we're really, in our accountability project, working in 14 countries to have them comment on these large commitments that have been made around gender equality and get their impression. We're actually going to release a report in UNGA next week on what they've been saying about what the commitments around gender equality is, and not just what their governments are saying, and use some opportunity to compare them. So I think that's going to be super important because these women we work with, they don't really focus on failure a whole lot. I don't even think they would see a major court case like this as a failure. I think they would see this as time to pivot, time to do something more, time to do something different. And that's, to me, what I talk about is like an everyday feminist. It's like they're always going to make a way out of no way. And we're in a situation where we're getting pushed backwards, and so we need to push forward harder.
Yeah, I really like that you draw attention not just to the resistance, but also the co-optation that we're seeing, right? With more and more governments putting women into positions of leadership, but meanwhile they're cracking down on women's organizations and civil society. So it's a very superficial kind of compliance. So it's good that you're focusing on that accountability angle. To end our back and forth here, you know, one thing I loved about the book is that it contains wisdom from a lot of people, right? A lot of different voices other than your own are in the book. And one section that struck me was you interviewed a Black Lives Matter organizer, I believe it was in Wisconsin, who talked about some of the activities they'd been doing in their communities. And what struck me is they were not just focused on activism, on policy change, but also on mutual aid, sort of supporting each other in their communities. And they reflected on how they'd asked elders in their community, you know, what does healing look like for you? And the elders in their community said, actually, we'd really like a community garden because the background we come from, we've been gardeners and we don't have any space to do gardening here. And that I thought was such a beautiful anecdote of how to think about movements holistically, not just about the resistance and the pushing, but also about the healing and the care that goes into building these relationships. So I wanted to end on asking you, you know, where do you find that space for healing and what kind of sustains your continued activism in that space, even when it gets difficult?
It's a great question, but I mean, like many of us, I think it's family. I think it's that prioritizing things that make us feel whole. And if it's gardening, then that's gardening, you know. And you know, for me, it's, you know, just reading. You know, nothing better than sitting on the beach and reading a good book. But I think we all have that. And I really appreciate you asking that question because we've been thinking hard on how we take care of our movement leaders because we know that burnout is a thing and that, you know, to keep showing up, you need to take care of yourself. And so we're trying to figure out how, and many other organizations, not just Global Fund for Women, trying to figure out how do you create that space for movement leaders to regroup, to reassess, to refresh so they can come out stronger than they went in. And there are spaces like that. There are opportunities for us to think about, you know, really, really showing up in different ways for movement actors, and in particularly these everyday feminists who they're at it morning to night, every day, all day. And we want to be able to offer some support to take care of yourself. And so I think the idea of well-being and social change has become much larger. And I think we need to all like lean in a little bit and figure out, not just for ourselves, how we refresh, but for others that are doing this work, how we can offer them that opportunity. So take care of our everyday feminists.
I love that. With that, I think it's a good opportunity to open it up to all of you. I'm sure there's questions. There's really interesting people in the audience. So please take this opportunity and maybe just signal with your hand and we'll have a microphone come to you.
There's some over here, yes.
Yes, Linda, over here.
Thank you. I'm Linda Robinson with the Council on Foreign Relations Women in Foreign Policy Program. Thank you very much for a wonderful book and your wonderful comments. It really brings to life the work you've been doing. I wanted to ask you if you would care to also talk about your on climate justice with USAID. And as part of that, just talking about how big organizations try to power down. We know Sam Power has pledged 25% of the funding of USAID will be local.
Yes.
By the end of her term, I presume. And obviously, that's a tough organization to reform with dependence on such major contractors and a really hideous set of requirements that I think you alluded to. So
yes. Sure. You know, in theory, you know, a partnership with Global Fund for Women and USAID is brilliant, right? I mean, you can't expect such a mammoth of an organization with the funding that goes out to the world to have close relationships with local partners and communities in the same way that you find in a women's fund. But with Global Fund for Women, we have more than, 5,000 partners in 176 countries. And we have other, sister funds, we call them, that are national and regional. And so our breadth to be able to hit those local actors is much broader. But we are in a partnership with USAID that actually hasn't even been announced publicly, because from the moment it started, there's been a lot of pushback from Congress. And with this new Congress, I think just recently, our funding has been held up completely. And so answering just a lot of questions, about who we are and what we do. But our partnership is specifically on climate justice and crisis. And so we work with communities, I mentioned in the Pacific small islands, as well as the Caribbean small island states. We work with gender justice movements in sub-Saharan Africa that are focused on climate adaptation and mitigation. And so all of this work is brilliant work. It's all being done by these communities of women's organizations that have been really showing up for their communities over the decades in many different ways. And now climate has become their primary concern for their communities because of the things that are necessary. And so that work is very important and ongoing. And as well as, I don't think I need to mention crisis. Our work, and we just, I think together since Afghanistan, has been to address both man-made and natural disasters that are just happening in around the world, and how important it is to get resources to local women's groups who are always on the front line in crisis. And we need to do that faster than just waiting for these large humanitarian baskets to get out to governments. So that work is also what we're doing together. But it's impossible, again, with all of I think the good intention with the localization program. The political issues are still real. We have been working hard in partnership to try to change some of the, not just change, but make known some of the challenges with some of the onerous, requirements that are due, and how we can hold them and not always push them down to the partners. But with that being said, I think we still have a political situation in this country that's very partisan, and it's holding up those funds right now. So, yeah.
Yes, over there.
Hi.
Thank you. So my name is Rafia Attalai, and I am the editor of the Middle East program publication here at the Carnegie Endowment. And I am originally from Oman, a Middle Eastern country. So thank you very much for that specific last question and for the answer. But I love the title of the book, and I think it is by itself very inspiring, because this idea, it's always in my mind. I'm a journalist, so I did only journalism all my life. I meet women like this all the time in different places in the Middle East. So I have this question. You said you have been to at least 15 different countries or lived. You mentioned that?
Yeah, yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
So have you been to one of the Middle East or North Africa, African country? And why I'm asking this question, because when you started your speech asking your mother, I think, about feminism, I think we are at the same stage now. Yes. And it's the same thing. It took me many years, maybe 2 years only ago, I could say I am a feminist. But otherwise, I've been all my life since I was a child thinking this way. But then, but for us, it wasn't a white woman thing, but it was a Western woman thing, you see? So we were accused of all like Western agenda. So other than social movement or women movement who bring change and social change, which we very much in need of, what other steps you think women in environment like the Middle East, where the freedoms, all the public liberties are, restricted, and it's very hard to do a lot of things, even getting fund from anywhere outside the countries themselves is forbidden or restricted. How we can, I meet all these women who are everyday feminists, try to do things, but individually. They cannot be in one group. They cannot do things as community work. What do you think I wouldn't say the perfect, but the necessary and basic steps to social change?
No, I mean, thank you for the question, and also the work that I know you're doing to make sure this happens. So I did serve. I served in Iraq, and I served in Egypt. I actually left the Foreign Service when I was evacuated out of Cairo, just because of personal reasons with the kids and the family, right? So when you read the book, you'll see it actually ends on some of this around what I have found. I talk about in Iraq how, actually I went, after 9/11. So I was there during a time when we were living in the green zone. And one of my core contacts, who I call an everyday feminist, was actually in the military, and she was doing a lot of work as a liaison to our Defense Department, which meant some of the work that we were doing, by way of USAID as well as state. And she was incredible. Very difficult sometimes to get people to listen to her in a room. Very difficult. And so all I can say is that I almost felt like it was, even though she knew far more than me. You ever sit at a table where there's, for the men in the room, you might not realize this, but you say something and then, lots of people totally ignore what you say, and then a guy says it. And then everybody's like, that's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. You're like, but didn't I just say that? And that's what I felt like, honestly, both in Iraq and Egypt, I did a lot of, they say something, it doesn't have to be at a table, but in a meeting, in the community, and I would just go and repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it. Because I do think that even words like feminism, again, I know we didn't use those words when I was there, right? But that spirit, that, the same characteristics that we've been sitting up here talking about live just like anywhere else in those communities. And there are women who have been doing so much work towards gender equality, but also towards developing communities, creating voice and space for those most marginalized. And so that is the work that we are in service to. And that is the work that we need to lift up. And so when you ask what do they need to do, I almost want to say they just need to keep doing what they do. And then we need to come in and support that. Because I think it's not enough for us to say that this is what needs to happen in those countries. I think it's more that we need to be in service to the people who are doing what we know needs to get done. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Yes, over there, just behind.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Deb Landau. I'm the Senior Gender Program Officer at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES. Really enjoyed your remarks so far. I actually have many questions, but one thing I've just been thinking about a lot and we've been talking about is this aspect of engaging men and boys in this work. And, I've just been thinking personally a lot about how often, this work happens in silos, and especially working on electoral justice, government governance, and electoral processes. A lot of countries, especially those who have recently experienced conflict or transitions, there's so many things happening, so many things that need to be worked on, that I find gender issues and women's inclusion kind of just falls to the wayside. And even within CSOs, many of them are led by men. The women usually are at kind of the lower levels within the CSO, and even that sort of gatekeeping can be tricky. But at the same time, obviously, men are impacted by gender as well, and kind of this paints a sort of a broader picture of the anti-gender sentiments and like movements globally. So I was wondering, from your experience, from your different backgrounds, have you found any successful kind of aspects of engaging men more from a feminist lens, especially those that might not directly work on gender issues, but to kind of pull them into the fold and to really expand the network of sort of advocates and champions in this space, whether they're working directly on women's rights issues or sort of the other avenues like governance and elections like we work on as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in the book, boys too, and so it's kind of two ways you can look at this. It's it's this aspect of the work that women do that often, I won't say all the time, but often gets relegated to it's about women. And has been unfair and completely untrue from every single place I ever lived. It is actually quite difficult to find women's organizations that only will work on women's issues. Even, so funny, it's just kind of not how we're built, because we're part of a human family. Even when you have programs around women's leadership, you ever notice that the women in those programs will always point out the men who are really, really good and should be there, and sometimes even training, no, you should get them to train. It's really hard to get women to just be very specific. And it's sort of like, I don't know, in Latin America, for those that come from that, so there's also been sort of the divide in the feminist movement there. It's like, and maybe even in the US, although I haven't done a whole lot of thinking about it, but it's this, if you go too far one way, people will sort of bring you back to the middle. It's like, we definitely need men at the table. So I think that's the one way to think about it, is to stop pretending that feminist work means it's work for women. So that's one thing. But then the other part of it that I think we that we probably have to really focus on is how do we get men and men's organizations, if you want to call them that, because they never call them that, right? But men's organizations to focus more on the work required for gender equality, because gender doesn't mean just women, but so I guess the thing that I'm thinking about, and I think we're seeing this more and more, is how do we get the organizations that are traditionally run by males to also really focus on feminist values and issues and women's issues in the countries where we work. And so I think that's they sort of go along two ways, but they're connected and tied together. And I think we're getting much better of having representatives from, male, let's just say, populations to really kind of stand up and talk about feminist issues. I was just at Women's Liver. I don't know how many people were there, but I was kind of impressed at how many men. Surely a much smaller number than the women there, but it was a good deal of male representation in the audiences and on the stages, and I think that's important. I think that's important. I think we need their voices, we need their partnership, and I think we can't pretend like it doesn't matter. Yeah.
I should say that there's a whole chapter in the book where you talk about this issue specifically.
Yes.
Yes, Manisha.
Thank you. Manisha Wafiq, I'm from Afghanistan. I work currently with Counterpart International and working on an Afghanistan project. We provide funding to CSOs and media organizations. And I've been working in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, founded a number of organizations and worked on women's economic empowerment specifically. So for the last 2 years, what has happened in Afghanistan, and which has not happened anywhere else in the world, many of you are aware, girls haven't been to school above 6th grade, and women are banned from jobs, from public spaces, and almost everything. And what has been called these days, and we are working on, is pretty much gender apartheid situation in Afghanistan. And a question that I've always asked these 2 years was, how about global feminists and global feminism movements? What can they do? Why can't these feminist organizations shake their governments up and can't hold their governments and policymakers accountable to Afghanistan's situation and to women's situation especially? So have you touched anything in your book on this matter of global feminism and how to really work on making feminists responsible for each other, and so they really raise their voice? Because really nowadays we are living in a true, with the technology today, in a true global village, right? Mm-hmm. It's not so far to see what's happening in Afghanistan or in somewhere else. So what do you think about that? How can we do that?
I mean, that's what we do. So I'm not sure how well you know the international network of women's funds, but that is the work that we do. It is advocacy worldwide. It's interesting because, some of our first, stories were around funding in Afghanistan and over looking at how things have moved over the last 20 years. I mean, this is the grossest violation of gender equality that we've seen in modern times, honestly. So, to have that much of a whip back is scary at best. But I would say that advocacy has been, quite real. We belong ourselves to a network of 50-ish women's funds around the world. We're global, and maybe 6 others are global, but for the most part, they're regional and national, and all of them have very much lifted up the situation. And we have a lot of stories to tell about the work that together we've been doing in Afghanistan, and then how now that work is having to be done from other places. The opening of Women Deliver actually included her name will escape me, but from Afghanistan, and one of our partners who had to leave, of course, like many did, Afghanistan, and open up her school for Afghan girls in Rwanda. And the meeting was in Rwanda, so it was like perfect. And she opened up the doors to the school so we can come and see it. And there were pledges right there on the stage from other governments to get more girls over to Rwanda from Afghanistan, because the story of the times is like, girls who've grown up in a country where they could get education, suddenly everything just stopped. And so we have been very much vocal about this issue at Global Fund for Women, of course, but so have so many other organizations. And this comes up. We were just on the Hill yesterday talking about this issue and comparing it to what we're seeing in other places around the world. Probably not as gross, but certainly we're seeing a lot of rollback. We're seeing a lot of pushback on feminist organizing, a lot of closing of spaces for women's organizations. And so these are things that I believe is most gross in Afghanistan and the way that we've seen it under the Taliban, but it's happening. And this is why it's important that we're having these conversations, and certainly one of the reasons why I wrote this book. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Nicole.
Hi, Nicole Ondal at CSIS. I just want to pull that thread a little bit about amplification without appropriation, particularly as you look at the intersection of Western feminism with global feminism, particularly in different cultures around the world. How do you thread that needle at your organization in terms of making sure that the idea of feminism isn't a broad brush application of what it means to be a feminist, particularly in different cultures? And to that end, also, how do you have these conversations as an ally and an advocate without presenting a fellow feminist's issues or point of view through your own filter?
Yeah, it's kind of easy. We just don't speak for them. So we are very committed through our communication and through our branding to allow people to speak for themselves. So I don't feel the pressure to have to articulate what's happening in Afghanistan. We have many incredible, incredible women who can articulate that. And whether it's Africa, Asia, Latin America, not just do they get to articulate it themselves, but they get to do it in their language. One of the things, I joined this organization 5 years ago, and just about that time, we released a film series that was actually Emmy nominated called Fundamental. And it was, it's 5 different countries, but women in those movements speaking about what's going on in their organizations is one of like, you can't buy that kind of thing as a new CEO, to have all of these women speaking to the situations in their country, what feminism means to them, or even if they're even using that word, what's happening in their settings. I think it was Kenya, Georgia, the country, it was Brazil, Pakistan, and I'm flaking on the 5th one. But, in all of those, they were shorts, just with women talking, and these are very popular women talking about, things that are happening. They're popular in their country, but ones that we don't know sometimes in the global north, of course, but have been doing amazing work over the years. And so part of and to me, feminist principles is that you don't have to speak for people. People can speak for themselves. And I think when I was talking about, sort of repeating people at the table, that's what we do. You just repeat what someone from that country said. You don't have to make it up. It's quite easy. And they're doing it already. They're already speaking. They're already getting into good trouble. as John Lewis says, in their countries, and so they've got lots of stuff that's being pumped out there that we can take. We don't have to create it. It's already there. Yeah.
I see a few more questions over there. Apta, yes, over to you.
Thank you so much for writing the book, for coming to speak with us. It's really amazing. My name is Apta Garg. I work as a gender technical advisor at Banyan Global. And I would love to hear your thoughts. I mean, Linda had mentioned the localization policy at USAID. And earlier when you were talking about internal biases. And I'd love to dig deeper into that, because when we talk about giving resources, giving support to local feminist organizations, we in DC and in a lot of the global North cities are also the barriers to like effectively doing that because of internal biases. I think when we talk to colleagues in a lot of our organizations, there's the resistance because deeper resources for local organizations potentially means like people can't keep their job, and they want to protect their job, their livelihoods. So resisting those transformative changes, even within USAID, you have resistance to it because of staffing, biases around the capacities, a lot of internal pushback, even as organizations are proclaiming their local efforts. And so as professionals working here and trying to create transformative changes within our own organizations and build that, how do we push back against those biases? How do we build the foundations to move towards that transformative change and start really invest and really hold ourselves accountable to investing in everyday feminists?
I think at this point, though, we have examples. We just had a small roundtable where the Canadian government was speaking about, I think 2015 is when they created the feminist foreign policy. And they've got like a lot of experience. I was even like, it's like a lot of like sort of things that they tried to do or that they are committed to doing, but then how the bureaucracy sort of works and how that ebbs and flows and how you just get better from learning. I don't think we're at the position right now where we need to recreate any kind of will. There's this kind of work happening all over the place. We were talking about even the Swedish government, which now I think they're no longer a feminist foreign policy, right? So, but how they've maintained the partnerships and relationships that they have. And I've literally spoken to the other side of the house in their country, and had like intelligent, fruitful conversations about the work and what it's doing and why it's so important. And they continue to move in a direction to continue to invest in that, even though politically they're from another framing. I think things are very toxic and difficult here, honestly, on our side. And I think I'm not sure how we're going to get at this, but I certainly believe organizations that are based in the U.S. have understood that, and the ones that are doing international development. I serve on Oxfam boards. I've seen, how they've moved through this journey from, safeguarding issues into a true feminist lens on everything that they do, right? And so over like 5-6 years, that has happened. So I think we have enough examples in our midst that this should no longer be the issue around, if it's possible or do we have the capacity to do it. We do. And this thinking around, will there be jobs for us and all that kind of nonsense, I don't understand it. This is an abundant planet. We can all live together and work together. And quite frankly, I find that the countries where we work are very receptive about what we can bring. Mostly it's about how we do it, how we try to move resources according to our own political priorities instead of theirs. So I think that's much of what we have to work on. When I say ourselves, it's within our organizations and to what we're trying to achieve through this work. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Malika Glover. I'm the Executive Director for WCAPS, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. But also for the last 20 years, I've worked at the Centers for Disease Control. I'm a social epidemiologist, so everything you're saying makes me tingle. But also, as an emergency manager, we are all very clear that all responses are local. You don't get the locals to move on anything when it comes to an emergency unless you get their buy-in, they're at the table, all of that. And also, as a social epidemiologist, there's lots of theories of change. So I'm wondering, is it helpful to have language that we can use from theories of social change, our lessons learned from local responses, all of that, to sort of help shift the perspective of people who have clearly co-opted the word feminist to something negative that only focuses on women, and use that as a sort of counter argument to this is not just about women. I mean, when you say the everyday feminist, I think about my grandmother, who was very much an advocate for breastfeeding. She wouldn't consider herself a feminist, but her biggest thing was men think breasts are for them, and that's why we have such a big breastfeeding problem. So if we, so I would consider her an everyday feminist, but she wouldn't. But that's what I think of when I think of the title of your book. And so, how can we get the people on the other side of the aisle who have used this language to turn people against the movement? How can we maybe use theories of social change or areas like emergency response where it's clear that it needs to be local for it to actually be successful? How can we kind of use the things that are maybe in other spaces outside of what they would consider feminist to get them to understand that they're going to have to shift their perspective a little bit?
Yeah, I know. It's like a catch-22. By the way, nice to meet you, and WCAPS is wonderful. And so I was thinking about it because I think when you read the stories in the book, it's I think it's relatable, right? So across whatever political affiliation you come from, I think people understand. I think everybody that goes to a hairdresser or a barber has the same sort of counseling that's happening in there, right? These conversations in these communities. But I do know that maybe the title of the book might stop people from buying it. So this is my way of trying to put it out and make it more relatable and not even so, academic, right? It's just, just sort of common sense kind of things that we have to think about across the board. But then I went with the title because I thought it was important to take the word back. And it's almost like, especially here, I have a 17-year-old child, and they're very, sort of gender neutral and fluid, but loves being a feminist, right? So it's easier for them to talk about being a feminist than it is to talk about being a girl or a woman. And so for me, that was kind of like the thing. I'm like, because I have to think about the people that come too. And this generation seems to be owning this space in a much more acceptable way than these divisions around men and women. So that's why I ended up using the term. So I hope people across the aisle will still pick it up. But I understand how we have to lean into what I think is something that both boys, girls, and neither are accepting about themselves and the communities and world that they want to live in. So buy it for somebody. Yeah, I had this theory, we should buy it for all the Republicans in the House. That's what we should do.
Yes, we have a question over here.
Thank you. First, kudos to Saskia and CEIP for organizing this event today and for bringing a group together of different ages and different backgrounds, which is really nice. So the question is actually reflecting on young people. And I'm sort of wearing one of my hats, which is I teach a graduate seminar on nonviolent collective action at Georgetown. I'm not a full professor, but what I see a lot of young faces here, and I'm sure a lot. So this is not a policy question, which is what one would normally ask at Carnegie, but I'm sure a lot of the young faces I'm seeing here are just really as we all are, admiring your accomplishments and achievements and what you will continue to do, and are wondering, as they're starting out in their careers, wow, how can I embrace, everyday feminism? How can I embrace gender equality and gender justice in my work, whether it's they want to go into the field in a more concentrated way, or whether they're working in something else like development, anti-corruption, democratization, or journalism. Do you have some advice for them?
Oh boy, that's a big question.
Sorry for asking such a big question.
A big non-policy related question. No, thank you, and pleasure to meet you. I think one of the things that I learned early on, and I talk about this also in the book, is understanding how to include, how to be intersectional in the approach to the work I do. And I don't think I understood it as much. I actually am a lawyer. I came from a human rights background and started through my work at the embassy, the USAID missions, really, doing more intersectional work around managing programs, but still very siloed, if that makes sense to you. So it's HIV/AIDS, not reproductive health. It was education, not democracy. And so one of the things that I would recommend is that people who have really focused on one area get brushed up on a lot of other areas. So for me, I would never be able to do like a gender program without thinking about all these different pots that we're talking about, and so healthcare is one of them. I mean, people have to be healthy and well in order to stand up and to push back. So I think whatever framing you're coming from, make sure that you understand the intersections. We talk about gender, but often we don't talk about race, and they're especially for me, they're intertwined. So I think, it's sort of living comfortably within these intersections and understanding what they mean and what they look like, I think will be huge for careers for young people, because I don't think we're going to continue to be so siloed. I don't think it will serve us to be so siloed, and it means that more and more people who can express the needs and solutions at those margins, I think are going to be really, really helpful for all of us. So that would be one big thing. And the second thing is, I think it's great to have a career plan, but just be super flexible. I mean, because you have no idea what amazing things can happen when you let go a little bit. Because right now, my whole world is about how do we unlock these resources to get this work done. I would have never thought. I thought I was going to be in somebody's court somewhere all my life, fighting as a lawyer, and a judge through these kind of things. And it just turned out this way, and I love it. It's amazing. And whatever I can do, write a book, sit up here and tap and dance for you all to get you to unlock these resources and get these women what they need is what I'll do, So, yeah. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Otherwise, I have another question that just came to me based on yours. And maybe I'll just take the privilege of asking you. With the question about young people reminded me, we do see these generational shifts in activism, including in women's activism or feminist activism around the world. And so I'm wondering now, at a more advanced stage of your career, do you observe some changes in how younger feminists are organizing compared to maybe the generations that you grew up with or encountered earlier on in your career? And what are some of those shifts? So what do you see as some of the newer developments, whether that's here in the US or elsewhere? Or maybe it's difficult to say, but I'm curious what you've observed.
No, the internet has been a game changer, right? How we use our digital tools. I was thinking about when I was in college doing anti-apartheid work, and divesting the university. Gosh, that would have been so helpful if we actually had a way to communicate with South Africans, going back to my sort of conversation about having them at the table. I'm not even sure, we had some folks that would come and go, but, imagine if we had this link, to South Africans in the work that we were doing every day. I think that would have been like a game changer. And I see them having that work, that ability to talk to each other in ways that they haven't before. Not all of it is healthy, though. So I don't want to overuse. I was just looking today at like who's a wonderful activist in Somalia, but there's lots of concern about sort of image and pictures and without like a lot of activity behind it. So I was like a little bit concerned about that. But the point is that there's access to people in ways that we've never had before, and so we should use that. And to the question of how do we get how do we change this? How do we get involved? I was like, bring them to the table. Well, now you can bring them to the table very easily. And so I hope that means that we have a generation of people now coming into the workforce who never have to worry about that. Don't do it without them. Because you can, goodness gracious, I've been to, like you have probably, communities around the world who really don't even have houses that stand up well, but can get on the Zoom. So it's like this. We have this opportunity to be much more inclusive. So I love that. I think that's part of the generation that we're talking about. And then the other part though that I have a little bit of pause about is what young people care about. And so how do we get at that? What is the thing that they are all? Because what I would hate is for us to have a generation of people that can access each other, but all they care about are things that are very superficial. So that's kind of where my head is, yeah.
Well, if we don't have further questions in the room, maybe I'll give you an opportunity to say a few final words. Are there some insights you'd want people to take home into their organizations or into their own work and lives from the book?
Yeah, listen, the book was an expression of, I think, what a lot of us are thinking about, what, like you were saying about, it's my grandmother, it's my mother. But that was what made it so hard. I could write those stories, forever. I had many of them that didn't make the book. I could interview a million wonderful people, and even those that I didn't make the book. But I do think that the thing about writing is what is it that you want to say and what is it that you hope people take away from it. And so that was the hardest part of organizing this book, was what is it that I hope for people to understand. And the big thing that I wanted people to understand is that all of this work is going on. You know it, I know it. We could all point to stories. We can all write about stories. But are we going to do the work to resource it? Are we going to get them what they need to continue? Are we going to get them what they need to be able to make the changes that we need? And so for me, the book was wonderful, to help me articulate and understand that is, at the end of the day, what we need to do. So it's not enough to just be like how great they are and to talk about the things that they've achieved. The Lima Gaboe stories, the Loretta Ross stories, it is for us to get up and to make sure that these women are resourced in the ways they need to be in order to make the change happen that they're seeking. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Latanya, for coming here. It's a real pleasure to hear you talk about your insights and about your work, and I think we all benefited tremendously. So really appreciate you taking the time to share with us today. And also thank you to all of you for coming and taking time out of your busy work days. And for those of you who joined online as well, really appreciate all of you coming and sharing in this experience. So
thank you. Thank you much. Okie dokie. So if anybody brought books and want to get signed, I'll be right back. I'm going to go to the restroom. Okay.